You wake up, but it's not morning. At least not the morning you know. The room is dark, cold, and smells of damp wool and smoke. Through a cracked window, you can hear the distant rumble of machinery already at work. You're 5 years old, maybe 6, it's hard to remember. Your mother counts the years by harvests that no longer come, and your father disappeared into a factory 3 years ago. You share a mattress with 4 siblings and a room that holds 3 families. Someone is coughing in the corner. They've been coughing for weeks. Outside, the streets are already busy. This is Manchester in 1835, or perhaps Leeds or Birmingham. The cities are growing faster than anyone can count. People flood in from the countryside, driven by enclosure acts that fenced off common lands and turned farmers into wanderers. They come seeking work, any work, and they find it in the mills. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, transforming Britain from a nation of farms and villages into the workshop of the world. And you, small as you are part of that transformation. The term Industrial Revolution makes it sound sudden, like a single moment when everything changed. But it was more like a tide, rising slowly over decades, drowning the old ways of life. It began with textiles. Before the 1700s, cloth was made at home. Families would spin thread and weave fabric in their cottages, working at their own pace. Then came the inventions. The flying shuttle in 1733, the spinning jenny in 1764, the water frame in 1779, the spinning mule in 1779. Each machine did the work of dozens of hands, and each machine needed workers to tend it. But here's the thing about those early machines. They weren't built for comfort or safety. They were built for speed and profit, and they were often built small enough that only small hands could operate them efficiently. That's where you come in. By the 1830s, it's estimated that nearly half of all factory workers in British textile mills are under 18 years old. Many are under 10. Some are as young as 4 or 5, their tiny fingers perfect for threading bobbins and crawling under machinery to retrieve fallen cotton. Let me paint you a picture of the landscape. Britain in the early 1800s is a country of contrasts so sharp they could cut you. In the countryside, ancient forests have been cleared for farmland, but now even that farmland is being enclosed, divided up by wealthy landowners who claim the commons for themselves. Villages that once hummed with the sound of handlooms now sit quiet, their cottages abandoned as families trek toward the cities. And what cities they are! London is already massive, a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million souls. But the real growth is happening in the north. Manchester's population explodes from 25,000 in 1772 to 400,000 by 1850. Glasgow, Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield all follow the same pattern. They grow in unplanned spurts, streets thrown down wherever builders can find space, houses crammed together like books on an overstuffed shelf. There's no sewage system to speak of. Waste runs in open gutters down the middle of streets. Wells get contaminated. Cholera and typhoid sweep through regularly, culling the weakest. The factories themselves rise like dark cathedrals dedicated to profit. Multi-story brick buildings with rows of windows that let in just enough light to work by, but never enough warmth. The biggest mills employ thousands. They run on water power at first, built beside rivers and streams, then increasingly on steam power, as James Watt's engine proves its worth. The steam engines burn coal, tons of it, and the smoke pours from chimneys day and night, turning the sky gray and the buildings black. You might wonder how this all came to be. How did a society decide it was acceptable to put children to work 12, 14, 16 hours a day in dangerous conditions? The answer is complex, tangled up in economics, philosophy, and desperation. On the economic side, child labor was cheap. A child might earn 1/10 what an adult man earned, sometimes less. They required less food, took up less space, and asked fewer questions. For mill owners operating on thin margins in a competitive market, the math was simple. There was also a philosophical justification, thin as it was. The prevailing belief among the middle and upper classes held that work was morally improving. Idleness led to vice. Therefore, even young children should be kept busy, preferably in productive labor. The alternative, they argued, was children running wild in the streets, falling into crime and sin. Better, they should learn discipline and industry in a factory. Never mind that the discipline often came from a leather strap or worse, or that the industry crushed bodies and spirits alike. Then there's the desperation angle. For poor families, every penny mattered. If you could work, you did. A family with 5 children might have 3 of them working by age 7, their combined wages barely enough to pay for rent and bread. Saying no to work wasn't really an option. The alternative was the workhouse, those grim institutions designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly destitute would enter. And sometimes not even that was available. Sometimes the alternative was starvation. The factory system developed its own rhythms, its own rules. Time, which had once been measured by the sun and the seasons, now marched to the factory bell. Workers arrived when the bell rang, worked while machines ran, and left only when the overseer permitted. Lateness meant fines. Talking meant fines. Mistakes meant beatings. The machines didn't care if you were tired, hungry, or sick. They ran and you kept up or got out. Let's talk about the machines themselves for a moment, because understanding them helps you understand what the children faced. The spinning mule, one of the most common machines in cotton mills, was a monster of wood and metal that could have over 1,000 spindles. It required constant attention. Threads broke constantly and had to be rejoined, a task called piecing. This required quick fingers and sharp eyes, and it had to be done while the machine was running. Children as young as 6 worked as piecers, darting between moving parts, reaching into gaps where adult hands wouldn't fit. Then there were the scavengers, usually the youngest children who crawled under the machines while they operated to collect loose cotton. The mules moved back and forth on tracks, and a scavenger had to be quick to avoid being crushed. Accidents were common. A moment's inattention, a stumble from exhaustion, and suddenly there's blood on the floor and a child screaming. Or not screaming anymore.
In the weaving sheds, the noise was incredible. Hundreds of power looms clacking away in a space designed more for machinery than humans. The weavers, often young women and older children, stood at their looms for the entire shift, guiding thread, watching for breaks, breathing in air thick with cotton fibers. Many developed lung diseases. The noise damaged hearing. By age 30, veteran mill workers were often deaf, their lungs damaged, their bodies bent from years of standing in awkward positions. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to you, that small child in the dark room. You're awake now, fully awake, though every part of you wants to sleep. Your older sister shakes you again. "Time to go," she whispers. She's 9 and has been working in the mills for 3 years. She'll show you what to do today, your first day. You stumble out of bed, feet hitting cold floorboards. There's no breakfast. Mother might have bread later if there's money. Father has already gone. He works at a different mill, one that starts an hour earlier. You dress in the dark. Your clothes are hand-me-downs, patched and repatched, too big in some places and too tight in others. Shoes are a luxury your family can't afford, so your feet are bare despite the cold. Outside, the street is a river of people, all flowing in the same direction. Men, women, children, all heading toward the mills. Their faces are gray in the pre-dawn light, expressions blank with exhaustion or resignation. Nobody talks much. It's too early, and there's nothing to say anyway. The mill rises ahead like a dark fortress, 5 stories tall, windows glowing with gaslight from within. The great water wheel is already turning, though you can't see it from here. You can hear it, though, a constant rushing sound that never stops. Your sister takes your hand and pulls you through the entrance, past the overlooker's office where the managers keep track of hours and wages, into the main floor of the spinning room. The noise hits you like a physical thing. It's not just loud, it's overwhelming, a combination of rattling, banging, whirring, and whooshing that drowns out everything else. Your sister's lips move, but you can't hear her words. She pulls you toward one of the spinning mules and gestures, you understand. This is where you'll work. She shows you the broken threads, demonstrates how to tie them back together while the machine moves. Her hands move so fast you can barely follow. Then she steps back and points at you. Your turn. You reach out, fingers trembling, and try to copy what she showed you. The thread slips through your fingers. You try again. The overlooker, a burly man with a leather strap hanging from his belt, is watching you. You can feel his eyes on you. You have to get this right. You have to prove you can do the work, or your family loses the income you're supposed to bring in. The pressure makes your hands shake worse. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. Welcome to childhood in the age of coal and cotton. It's going to be a long day. It's going to be a long life. But we're not alone. Thousands of children just like you are starting their shifts right now, all across Britain. Their stories are mostly forgotten now, buried under centuries of progress and prosperity built on their backs. But tonight, we're going to remember them. We're going to walk through their days, their struggles, their rare moments of joy, and the slow, grinding campaign that eventually gave them back something resembling childhood.
So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the rhythm of these words replace the rhythm of those machines. And let's begin properly with a day in the life of a factory child. Section 2. Daily Life in the Mills. 4,000 words. The day starts before dawn, as we've established, but let's be more specific about what that means. In summer, you might report for work at 5:30 or 6 a.m. In winter, when daylight comes late, you still start at the same time, walking through dark streets where crime is common and accidents frequent. Children fall into ditches, get run over by carts, or simply disappear. The lucky ones make it to the mill. Once inside, the work begins immediately. There's no warm-up period, no gentle introduction to the day. The machines have been running since midnight or earlier, tended by the night shift, and now it's your turn. If you're a piecer, you take your position alongside the spinning mule. The mule operator, usually an adult man, controls the machine's movements. Your job is to watch for broken threads and fix them instantly. Here's what that actually involves. The mule carriage moves backward, stretching the cotton fibers and twisting them into thread. This happens fast, faster than walking pace. As it moves, threads break. Maybe a weak spot in the cotton, maybe too much tension, maybe just bad luck. When a thread breaks, you have to run alongside the moving carriage, grab both ends of the broken thread, twist them together in a specific way that creates a join almost as strong as unbroken thread, and do this while the carriage is still moving. Then you run back to your position and wait for the next break. The carriage moves backward and forward, all day long. You run with it, back and forth, hundreds of times per hour. Your feet hurt. Your legs ache. Your fingers get raw from the constant friction of cotton thread. The air is thick with cotton fiber, a fine white dust that gets in your nose, your mouth, your lungs. You cough, but you can't stop working to cough properly. You develop what they call mill cough, a hacking sound that becomes as much a part of the factory soundscape as the machines themselves. Let's talk about timing. A typical shift in the 1830s was 12 hours, often longer. Some factories ran 13 or 14-hour days. Saturday was usually a half day, maybe 8 hours. Sunday was the only full day off, and even then, some mills ran 7-day weeks during busy periods. That means a child might work 70 to 80 hours per week, sometimes more. There were also technical roles in the hierarchy. Mechanics kept the machines running, fixed breakdowns, and adjusted settings. Skilled spinners and weavers operated the most complex machinery. These adult workers were better paid than the children, but they also depended on those children. A spinner's productivity relied on his piecers working efficiently. If the children were slow or made mistakes, it affected the spinner's wages. This created another layer of pressure on the children, who had to satisfy not just the overlookers, but also the adult workers whose income depended on them. Let's talk about the economics more specifically, because money was really what drove everything. A typical cotton mill in the 1830s might cost £50,000 to build and equip. That was an enormous sum, equivalent to millions today. The owner needed to recoup that investment and make a profit. Cotton prices fluctuated based on crop yields in America, demand in markets, competition from other mills. Profit margins could be thin, sometimes just a few percentage points. In this environment, labor costs were one of the few variables an owner could control. You couldn't control the price of raw cotton or the demand for finished cloth, but you could control how much you paid your workers. So, wages were kept as low as possible. And since children could do many jobs adequately, why pay adult wages when you could pay child wages? Let's run some numbers. An adult male spinner might earn 20 shillings per week. His 2 child piecers might earn 2 shillings each, so 4 shillings total. That's still cheaper than hiring a second adult, even though the children were doing significant work. A scavenger might earn only 1 shilling per week. For a mill employing 300 children, keeping their wages low saved hundreds of pounds per year. Some mill owners genuinely tried to do better. We mentioned Robert Owen earlier. Let's talk about him more specifically. Owen took over the new Lanark Mills in Scotland in 1800. What he found horrified him. Children as young as 5 working 13-hour days in terrible conditions. He implemented radical reforms. He refused to employ children under 10. He reduced working hours to 10.5 per day. He built schools and insisted children receive education. He improved housing for workers. Initially, his partners opposed these changes, arguing they would destroy profitability. But Owen proved them wrong. His mills remained profitable. Productivity actually increased because workers were healthier and more motivated. And New Lanark became famous across Europe as proof that ethical factory management was possible. But Owen remained an outlier. Most owners looked at his example and found reasons it wouldn't work for them. Owen's mills had particular advantages, they said. He had more capital to invest. His workers were different. His market was specialized. There was always a reason why his methods couldn't be replicated. The truth was simpler. They didn't want to replicate them. The existing system worked fine for their purposes, and change threatened their profits. The relationship between owners and workers was fundamentally adversarial. Owners wanted maximum output for minimum cost. Workers wanted decent wages and humane conditions. There was no middle ground that satisfied both, or at least none that the owners were willing to seek. When workers tried to organize or protest, owners responded with force. Workers could be fired, evicted from company housing, blacklisted so no other mill would hire them. The power was entirely on one side. There were moments of paternalism, though. Some owners provided housing for workers, built at the owner's expense and rented at subsidized rates. This was partly practical since mills were often built in rural areas without existing housing stock. But it also gave owners additional control. If you lived in a company house and lost your job, you lost your home too. That was a powerful incentive to stay obedient. Some mill towns developed a complex social ecology. The owner might fund a church, support the local school, sponsor festivals. He'd present himself as a beneficent figure, father to his workers. In return, he expected deference and loyalty. This paternalistic model could create communities that functioned reasonably well by the standards of the time, but it depended entirely on the owner's personality. A cruel owner could make a mill town hell on earth, and there was no recourse. Let's talk about what the owners knew versus what they admitted. They absolutely knew children were suffering in their mills. They saw the accident reports. They walked through the factories occasionally and saw the exhausted faces, the injuries, the stunted bodies. They couldn't have been unaware. But they compartmentalized this knowledge, rationalized it, or simply accepted it as the necessary price of industrial progress. When pressed by reformers or parliamentary committees, owners gave predictable answers. The work wasn't really that hard. Children were naturally resilient. The alternative would be unemployment and starvation. Foreign competition made it impossible to raise costs. Any regulation would destroy British industry. These arguments were deployed again and again, a wall of words defending the status quo. Some of this was genuine belief, warped by class prejudice and economic incentive. Some was pure cynicism, men defending their profits behind a mask of principle. It's hard to separate the two, and it probably varied by individual. What matters is the effect. These arguments delayed reform for decades, during which countless children suffered and died. The managers and overlookers, being closer to the daily reality, had fewer illusions. They saw what the work did to children. But their jobs depended on maintaining production and discipline. Speaking out against the system meant losing their livelihoods. Most chose silence or rationalized their role. They were just following orders, just doing their jobs. The children's suffering wasn't their responsibility, it was the system's. And what could one person do against an entire system? This is the banality of evil that would later be identified in other contexts. People doing terrible things not because they were monsters, but because it was their job, because everyone else was doing it, because questioning it seemed pointless or dangerous. The factory system created roles that required cruelty, then filled those roles with ordinary people who convinced themselves they were just being practical. There were exceptions. Overlookers who were kinder than they had to be, who looked the other way when children rested briefly or shared food. Managers who advocated for minor improvements, better ventilation or slightly shorter hours. These small mercies mattered to the workers who benefited from them, but they didn't change the fundamental nature of the system.
By the 1830s and 1840s, pressure for reform was building. Investigators were documenting conditions, newspapers were publishing exposés, religious groups were mobilizing, Parliament was beginning to pay attention. The owners fought back hard. They formed associations to resist regulation. They lobbied MPs. They published pamphlets arguing that interfering with factories would destroy the economy. They threatened to move production overseas if forced to improve conditions. The mill owners weren't monolithic, though. A few supported reform, either out of genuine conscience or because they calculated it would benefit them by eliminating less scrupulous competitors. If everyone had to follow the same rules, being humane wouldn't put you at a competitive disadvantage. This argument eventually gained traction, though it took decades. In the meantime, the system ground on. Owners made their profits, managers ran their operations, overlookers cracked their whips. And children worked and suffered and sometimes died, their lives the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution. Later, when Britain became the wealthiest nation on earth, when London was the financial capital of the world, when British manufactured goods dominated global markets, few people asked what that prosperity had cost. The children in the mills weren't part of the triumphant narrative. They were footnotes, if mentioned at all. But they were real. They had names, families, hopes, and fears. They were children who should have been playing, learning, growing up safe. Instead, they were caught in a system that valued profit over humanity, that saw them as economic units rather than human beings. The owners and managers who ran that system weren't all monsters. Many were respectable members of their communities, churchgoers and family men. But they participated in and perpetuated a profound injustice, and the damage they did echoed across generations. Let's shift perspective now and look at the people who ran these factories, because understanding them helps us understand how the system persisted for so long. At the top were the mill owners themselves, usually men from middle-class backgrounds who had accumulated enough capital to invest in machinery and buildings. Some were self-made men who had worked their way up from the shop floor. Others inherited family businesses. A few were aristocrats, diversifying their investments. The owners fell into a spectrum. At one end were the genuine villains, men who saw workers as nothing more than parts of the production machinery, to be used up and replaced as economics dictated. These owners maximized hours, minimized costs, and paid no attention to worker welfare beyond what was absolutely necessary to prevent complete rebellion. They lived in comfortable houses far from their factories, insulated from the daily reality of the lives they controlled. In the middle were the pragmatists, probably the majority. They weren't necessarily cruel men, but they were businessmen first. They knew their factories were harsh places, knew children suffered, but they rationalized it. Workers needed employment, didn't they? Without the factories, these children would starve or end up in crime. At least here they were earning something, learning discipline, contributing to their families. The market set wages, not them. If they paid more, they couldn't compete with other mills. It was just business.
At the other end were the reforming owners, a small minority who tried to do better. They built schools for their workers' children, created better housing, reduced hours, improved conditions. Robert Owen in Scotland was probably the most famous example. At his new Lanark mills, he prohibited child labor under 10, provided education, and created what he called a village of cooperation. His mills were profitable, proving it was possible to treat workers better and still make money. But men like Owen were rare. Most owners viewed his ideas as dangerous radicalism that would destroy the competitiveness of British industry. If we all have to provide schools and shorter hours, they argued, then British textiles will cost more than imports from America or India. We'll lose market share. The mills will close. Everyone will be worse off. This was the perpetual argument. Any reform would destroy the industry that fed the nation. Let's look at a specific example. We'll call him William Hammond, though that's not a real name. Hammond owned 3 cotton mills in Lancashire, employed about 2,000 workers, including several hundred children. He'd inherited the business from his father, expanded it successfully, and lived in a manor house 20 miles from his factories. He visited his mills quarterly to review the books and address any major issues. The day-to-day operations were handled by managers. Hammond considered himself a fair employer. He paid the going rate for labor, which was to say, as little as the market allowed. His factories ran 13-hour days, standard for the industry. He employed children as young as 6, because that was legal and economically necessary. When reformers wrote pamphlets criticizing factory conditions, Hammond felt unfairly attacked. He was just running a business within the law. If legislators wanted different conditions, let them pass different laws. But Hammond was also a church-going man, a believer in providence and the natural order. He thought poverty was unfortunate but inevitable, a consequence of moral failing or simply bad luck. The poor were poor because they lacked industry, thrift, and discipline. His factories provided an opportunity to learn these virtues. Yes, the work was hard, but hard work built character. Wasn't it better for children to be working than running wild in the streets? When one of Hammond's mills had a serious accident where a 9-year-old scavenger was crushed by a spinning mule, Hammond felt genuine regret. He even paid for the funeral, which was more than many owners would do. But he didn't see it as his responsibility to redesign the machinery to be safer. Accidents happened. That was life. The parents knew the risks when they sent their children to work. Nobody was forcing them. This mindset was reinforced by the economic theories of the time. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations had been published in 1776, arguing that free markets led to optimal outcomes for society. Interfere with wages or working conditions, and you disrupted the natural efficiency of the market. This idea appealed strongly to mill owners who wanted to believe their pursuit of profit was actually serving the greater good. There was also a strong element of class prejudice. The middle and upper classes simply didn't view working-class children the same way they viewed their own children. Working-class children were hardy, or so the thinking went. They could handle conditions that would harm a gentleman's son. They were used to hardship. Besides, they'd never known any different. This was their station in life, ordained by providence or nature or simple circumstance. Below the owners were the managers, the men who actually ran the mills day to day. These were often former skilled workers who had proven themselves capable and trustworthy. The manager's job was to maximize output, minimize costs, and maintain discipline. They were paid based partly on the mill's productivity, creating a direct financial incentive to push workers harder. Managers had to balance multiple pressures. The owner wanted profits. The workers wanted better conditions and higher pay. The market demanded competitive prices. Machinery constantly needed maintenance and repair. Raw materials had to be ordered, deliveries coordinated, customers satisfied. It was a stressful position, and managers often took that stress out on the workers below them. Then came the overseers, sometimes called overlookers in northern mills. These were the men who patrolled the factory floors, supervising the workers directly. An overlooker might be responsible for 50 or 100 workers, depending on the size of the mill. Their job was to ensure everyone worked at maximum efficiency and maintained discipline. Overlookers had immense power over the workers beneath them. They decided who got hired and fired. They assigned positions, good ones near warm pipes or bad ones near cold drafts. They determined when breaks happened and how long they lasted. They controlled the pace of work by controlling the machines. And critically, they enforced discipline through punishment. The methods of punishment varied by overlooker and by mill, but they were universally harsh. The leather strap was standard equipment, used to beat children who worked too slowly or made mistakes. Some overlookers preferred a length of rope or a stick. Others used their fists. The punishments left bruises, sometimes broke bones. Children learned to fear the overlooker's approach, to work harder when he was watching, to hide mistakes if possible. But not all overlookers were sadists. Some were just men doing a job they didn't particularly enjoy, enforcing rules they didn't create. A few were actually sympathetic to the workers, though they couldn't show it too openly without endangering their positions. The system demanded a certain level of harshness. An overlooker who was too lenient would be seen as weak, and the workers might become difficult, meaning they might start demanding better conditions or questioning authority. Not everyone accepted the factory system as inevitable. From early on, there were voices of resistance, people who looked at the grinding exploitation of child labor and said, "This is wrong, this must change." The path to reform was long and frustrated, full of setbacks and compromises, but change did eventually come. Let's trace that journey because it's a story of human courage and persistence against enormous opposition.
The earliest protests came from the workers themselves. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, as factories began to spread, craftsmen who saw their livelihoods threatened by machines organized resistance. The Luddites, named after a probably mythical figure called Ned Ludd, began breaking machinery in textile factories. They weren't mindless vandals. They were skilled workers who understood that the new machines, tended by cheap child labor, were destroying their way of life. The government responded to Luddism with brutal force. Machine breaking became a capital offense. Soldiers were deployed to protect factories. Luddites were arrested, tried, and sometimes executed or transported to Australia. By 1813, the movement was crushed. But it had made a point. The transition to industrial capitalism wasn't smooth or inevitable. It was contested, resisted, and imposed by force. Workers also tried to organize unions, though this was illegal for much of the early industrial period. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 prohibited workers from combining to demand higher wages or better conditions. Meetings were broken up by authorities. Leaders were arrested. Despite this, secret unions formed, organizing strikes and slowdowns. These early unions focused mainly on skilled adult workers, but they occasionally took up the cause of child workers too. A major strike might unfold like this. Workers at a mill would demand shorter hours or higher pay. The owner would refuse. Workers would down tools and walk out. The owner would hire replacement workers or call in the authorities to force the strikers back. Sometimes the strike would succeed in winning minor concessions. More often, it failed, with workers returning to the same conditions, possibly worse, having lost wages during the strike and facing retaliation. The breakthrough for organized labor came in 1824, when the Combination Acts were repealed, making unions legal. This didn't mean workers suddenly had power, but it did mean they could organize openly. Trade unions began forming more systematically, collecting dues, building strike funds, coordinating across factories. The movement was strongest among skilled workers, but it raised consciousness about workers' rights generally. Parallel to worker resistance was a growing reform movement among middle-class activists. These were often religious figures, particularly from nonconformist churches like Methodists and Quakers, who believed industrial exploitation was morally wrong. They investigated conditions, published reports, petitioned Parliament, and agitated for legal reforms. One of the earliest factory reformers was Robert Peel the Elder, himself a textile manufacturer, but also a member of Parliament. In 1802, he pushed through the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, the first law regulating child labor in factories. It applied only to apprentices and cotton mills and required them to receive basic education, limited their work to 12 hours per day, and mandated certain sanitary standards. The 1802 Act sounds progressive, but it was almost completely ineffective. There was no enforcement mechanism, no inspectors to check compliance. Mill owners who wanted to follow the law could do so. Those who didn't faced no consequences. Most didn't. The law made Parliament feel good about addressing the problem without actually changing much.
The real fight began in the 1830s with the emergence of the factory reform movement. A coalition of humanitarian activists, religious leaders, and even some progressive aristocrats began pushing for comprehensive regulation of child labor. Key figures included Richard Oastlew, a Tory landowner who called factory work Yorkshire slavery and wrote passionate letters to newspapers describing conditions. John Fielden, a mill owner who employed better practices and wanted the law to require his competitors to do the same. And Michael Sadler, an MP who championed factory reform in Parliament. In 1832, Sadler secured a parliamentary committee to investigate child labor. The committee heard testimony from workers, including children, as well as mill owners and managers. The testimony from workers was damning. They described beatings, accidents, exhaustion, hunger, children too tired to eat when they got home at night. One worker testified about seeing a child's scalp torn off by a machine. Another described children working 14-hour days, starting at age 6. The mill owners testified too, presenting a very different picture. They claimed conditions were fine, that workers were well treated, that children were happy in their work. When confronted with specific abuses, they blamed rogue overseers or claimed ignorance. The committee's report concluded that serious abuses existed and recommended limiting children's working hours. This led to the 1833 Factory Act, a genuine milestone in labor law. It prohibited employment of children under 9 in textile mills. Children aged 9 to 13 could work only 8 hours per day and had to receive 2 hours of education. Young people aged 13 to 18 were limited to 12 hours per day. And critically, the act established factory inspectors to enforce compliance. The mill owners fought this act fiercely. They argued it would destroy British competitiveness. They lobbied MPs, organized petitions, published pamphlets predicting economic disaster. Some threatened to close their mills rather than comply. When the act passed anyway, many owners looked for loopholes. Since the law applied only to textile mills, other industries remained unregulated. Even in textiles, some owners falsified children's ages or simply ignored the law and hoped inspectors wouldn't notice. The inspectors, just 4, initially for the entire country, were overwhelmed. They couldn't possibly visit every mill regularly. Some owners bribed inspectors to overlook violations. Others scheduled visits when conditions were at their best, hiding the worst abuses. Still, the inspectors did make a difference. Some owners, who might have ignored a law without enforcement, took it seriously once they knew someone might check. The education requirement was particularly problematic. Most factory towns had no schools suitable for factory children. Mill owners had to provide schooling, but many did this grudgingly, hiring unqualified teachers and providing minimal instruction. Still, even bad education was better than none, and some children learned to read and write in these mill schools who otherwise never would have. The 1833 Act was just the beginning. Reformers immediately began pushing for stronger protections. Lord Shaftesbury, an aristocratic evangelical Christian, became the movement's parliamentary champion. He was genuinely motivated by religious faith, believing that exploiting children was a sin that demanded correction. He gave speeches in Parliament describing the suffering of factory children in vivid, emotional terms that moved even his opponents.
But progress was incremental and frustrating. The 1844 Factory Act further reduced hours for children and extended protections to women. The 1847 Factory Act finally achieved the 10 hours movement goal of limiting women and young people to 10 hours per day. Each reform faced fierce opposition from mill owners who predicted economic ruin. Each reform proved less destructive than predicted. One tactic reformers used was moral persuasion. They published books and pamphlets with titles like The Cry of the Children that portrayed factory work as a moral outrage. Poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote verses about suffering factory children that appeared in respectable periodicals. The goal was to make it socially unacceptable to profit from child exploitation, to shame owners into better behavior. This had limited success. Some owners genuinely were moved and improved conditions. Others dismissed the reformers as naive sentimentalists who didn't understand economics. The general public was sympathetic to factory children in the abstract, but often prioritized cheap goods over workers' welfare. The cotton shirts and cloth in their homes came from those factories after all. Demanding better conditions meant accepting higher prices. Another reform tactic was documentation. Investigators would visit factories, sometimes undercover, and document what they saw. The most famous investigative work was probably done by Friedrich Engels, a young German businessman who spent time in Manchester in the early 1840s. His book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, provided detailed, horrifying descriptions of industrial poverty and exploitation. Engels wasn't just an observer. He was developing, along with Karl Marx, a revolutionary critique of industrial capitalism. They argued that the exploitation of workers, including children, wasn't an accidental byproduct of industrialization, but its fundamental logic. Capitalists needed to extract maximum value from labor while paying minimum wages. This created inevitable conflict that would eventually result in workers overthrowing the system. This revolutionary perspective frightened many people, including moderate reformers who wanted improvements within the existing system, not its destruction. But Marxist analysis did help people understand that the problems weren't just about bad individual owners or lack of regulation. They were structural, built into industrial capitalism itself. This realization pushed some reformers toward more radical solutions. The Chartist movement, which emerged in the 1830s and peaked in the 1840s, represented working-class political demands. Chartists called for universal male suffrage, secret ballots, payment for MPs so that working men could serve, and other democratic reforms. They held massive rallies, submitted petitions with millions of signatures, and occasionally threatened armed uprising. Though Chartism ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals, it demonstrated that workers were capable of organized political action. Child workers themselves rarely organized openly. They were too young, too exhausted, too frightened of losing their jobs. But there were small acts of resistance. Children might work slowly when overseers weren't watching. They might sabotage machinery subtly, a handful of dirt in gears, a cut belt. They'd warn each other about particular dangerous moments or cruel overseers. These small rebellions didn't change the system, but helped individuals maintain some dignity.
There were also spectacular escapes. Children who ran away from factories and tried to make their way back to families in the countryside. Most were caught and returned, facing severe punishment. A few made it. Some children maimed themselves deliberately, damaging a hand or foot, because being disabled meant you couldn't work in the mills anymore. Think about that level of desperation. Harming yourself permanently seemed better than continuing to work. Reformers also worked at the local level. Town councils in some industrial cities passed bylaws regulating sanitation, housing, and working conditions. These local regulations were often stronger than national laws. Manchester, for instance, appointed health officers who investigated living conditions and could order improvements. This helped with disease outbreaks, but didn't address the fundamental problem of exploitative labor. Churches played an ambiguous role. Most established churches, particularly the Church of England, were closely aligned with the ruling classes and hesitant to challenge the economic system. But nonconformist denominations, especially Methodists and Quakers, were often at the forefront of reform. They ran Sunday schools where factory children could learn to read. They organized charitable relief. They preached that treating workers badly was a sin. Some mill owners were religious men who felt genuine tension between their faith and their business practices. They wanted to believe they were good Christians while also maximizing profits from child labor. This cognitive dissonance could be resolved in various ways: by making minor improvements while keeping fundamental practices unchanged, by blaming workers for their own poverty, or by convincing themselves that factory work was actually good for children's moral development. The role of women in the reform movement deserves mention. While most public activists were men, women couldn't vote or hold political office, women did significant behind-the-scenes work. They organized petition drives, raised funds, wrote pamphlets, and ran Sunday schools. Some upper-class women visited factories and wrote about what they saw, using their social position to gain access and credibility. By the 1850s, the momentum for reform was building across multiple fronts. More laws were passed, more inspectors hired, more schools opened. The economic arguments against reform were gradually losing force as British industry remained profitable despite regulations. Owners discovered that healthy, educated workers were actually more productive than exhausted and brutalized ones. Self-interest and morality began to align, at least partially. But let's be clear, reform was painfully slow. The first significant law was in 1833. 50 years later, children were still working in factories, still suffering injuries, still denied proper childhoods. The improvements were real, but gradual. Each step forward required years of activism, documentation, lobbying, and political pressure. The mill owners fought every inch, and they had money and power on their side.
The children themselves saw some improvements, but not transformation. A 10-hour day was better than 14 hours, but it was still exhausting. Basic education was better than no education, but mill schools were often miserable. Being 9 instead of 6 when starting work gave a few more years of childhood, but not many. The fundamental reality of industrial exploitation continued, just with slightly less brutal edges. What finally changed things, more than moral activism, was economic development. As Britain grew wealthier, as other sectors of the economy expanded, as education became more valued, the economic calculus shifted. Cheap child labor became less essential. Machines became more sophisticated, requiring skilled operators rather than just small hands. The middle class expanded and needed clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, positions requiring education. Parents began seeing education as an investment that might help their children escape factory work. By the late 1800s, compulsory education laws were passed,
requiring children to attend school at least part-time. This wasn't primarily about protecting children from exploitation. It was about creating a more skilled workforce for an increasingly complex economy. But the effect was to reduce child labor significantly. You couldn't work 14-hour days and attend school. Gradually, the two became incompatible, and education won. The Factory Acts kept getting strengthened. More industries covered, more restrictions on hours, higher minimum ages, better enforcement. By the early 1900s, the kind of child labor that had been routine in the early industrial period was illegal, though it still happened in unregulated sectors. The transformation took a century. The resistance and reform movement teaches us several lessons. Change is possible, but requires sustained effort over long periods. Moral arguments alone rarely succeed against entrenched economic interests. You need political power, legal mechanisms, and economic pressure. Small victories matter, even when full justice seems distant. And individuals can make a difference, whether they're reformers like Shaftesbury, investigators like Engels, or workers who organized and resisted despite the personal cost. The factory whistle didn't just regulate work time, it regulated life itself. When that whistle blew signaling the end of shift, children poured out into streets that offered little relief from the hardships inside. Let's step outside the mills now and look at what life was like for factory children beyond working hours, because understanding their full existence requires seeing the entire cycle of exploitation and survival. Housing was the first problem. Factory towns grew so quickly that housing couldn't keep pace. Builders threw up cheap housing as fast as possible, cramming maximum occupants into minimum space. A typical working-class house might be what was called back-to-back, meaning it shared 3 walls with neighboring houses and had no back door or yard. These houses were usually 2 rooms, one on each floor, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet per room. In these tiny spaces, entire families lived, not nuclear families of parents and children, but extended arrangements where multiple families might share. Mary, our composite child from earlier, lived in one room with her mother, 3 siblings, and sometimes her older brother when he wasn't sleeping at the mine. But their building housed 8 families total, sharing a single privy in the yard, a single water pump, no privacy whatsoever.
The lack of sanitation was staggering. Privies were just holes in the ground, emptied irregularly by night soil men who carted the waste to dumps outside town. But the privies were always full, always overflowing, especially when it rained. Human waste ran in open gutters through courtyards where children played. The smell was horrific, but people became nose-blind to it, hardly noticing what would make a modern person retch. Water came from communal pumps, often contaminated by the same waste that flowed through the streets. People knew the water made them sick, but they had no choice. You drank the water or died of thirst. Cholera outbreaks were regular occurrences. In 1832, a cholera pandemic killed thousands in British cities. It would return in 1848, 1854, and 1866. Each outbreak disproportionately affecting the poor in their crowded, filthy housing. Let's walk through a typical courtyard in an industrial slum. You enter through a narrow passage between buildings, hardly wide enough for 2 people to pass. The courtyard is maybe 30 feet square, surrounded on all sides by tall brick buildings that block out most sunlight. The ground is permanently damp, a mixture of rainwater, wastewater from washing, and seepage from the overflowing privy. Puddles never dry, moss grows on the ground. Around this courtyard, perhaps a dozen families live, maybe 60 people total. Children are everywhere, dozens of them, the ones too young to work yet. They play in the filth because there's nowhere else to go. They have no toys, so they play with sticks, stones, bits of broken pottery. Sometimes they catch rats and play with them until the rats bite and escape. Disease is a constant companion.
You can see it in the children's faces. Pale skin, swollen bellies from malnutrition, sores that won't heal. The buildings themselves are barely adequate. Walls were thin brick, often cracked, letting in cold and damp. Windows were small and often broken, covered with rags or boards instead of glass. Floors were bare wood, rotting in places. There was no insulation. In winter, ice formed on the inside of walls. In summer, the heat was stifling, the air still and fetid. Furniture was minimal. A factory family might have a table, a few stools, a mattress or two stuffed with straw. That was all. No closets, no dressers, no decorations. Clothes were hung on pegs or kept in sacks. Cooking was done over a small fireplace if you could afford coal, which many couldn't. Meals were simple: bread, potatoes, occasionally a bit of bacon or cheese. Meat was rare, a luxury for Sunday, if wages had been good that week. Let's talk about diet more specifically, because nutrition was crucial to these children's development. A typical breakfast might be oatmeal porridge, made with water, not milk, unsweetened. Or bread with dripping, the fat from cooking meat, though many families couldn't afford even that. Some children went to work with nothing in their stomachs, working until the dinner break on empty. The dinner break meal was similar. More bread, maybe with butter if the family could afford it, possibly a piece of cheese. On good days, there might be cold potato from the previous night's dinner. This was the main meal of the day for many factory children, consumed in a half-hour break before returning to 12 more hours of work. The actual dinner, eaten after the shift ended, might be a bit more substantial. Potato formed the base of most meals, sometimes boiled, sometimes made into a hash with scraps of whatever else was available. In northern England, oat cakes were common, thick pancakes made from oat flour. These were filling, but not particularly nutritious. Occasionally there'd be soup, often just water with vegetable scraps and maybe a bone for flavor. Meat was reserved for Sundays, and even then only in families where wages were relatively good. A bit of mutton or bacon, boiled with vegetables, split among the entire family. Children might get 1 or 2 small pieces. The rest was for the father, whose manual labor was considered to require better nutrition. This gender hierarchy in food distribution meant that girls and younger children often received the least and poorest food. The result was chronic malnutrition. Factory children were stunted, thin, and vulnerable to every disease that came through. Rickets was common, a vitamin D deficiency that softened and deformed bones, causing bow legs and curved spines. Anemia from iron deficiency left children pale and weak. Dental problems were universal. Most adults had lost most of their teeth by their 30s. Let's think about a child's day from end of shift to next morning. Mary finishes work at 7:30 p.m. She walks home through dark streets, arrives around 8 p.m. The family eats dinner, bread and potato and a bit of dripping tonight. This takes maybe 20 minutes. Then there are chores. Water needs to be fetched from the pump for washing and cooking. Chamber pots need to be emptied. If there's clothing to mend, that needs to be done. Mary's mother does most of this, but Mary helps. She's tired, bone tired, but the work has to be done. By 9:30 p.m., the chores are finished. The younger children are already asleep. Mary lies down on the mattress, pulls a thin blanket over herself, and tries to sleep, despite the cold, despite the noise from neighboring rooms, despite the coughing that's become constant. She sleeps perhaps 7 hours if she's lucky, less if someone is sick or if there's disturbance in the night. Then at 5 a.m., the cycle begins again. 7 hours of rest for 13 hours of work, and the rest time isn't even real rest because of the chores and the poor sleeping conditions. Weekends offered only slight relief. Saturday was a half day at most mills, finishing around 2 p.m. This gave families time for shopping, laundry, cleaning. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, but it was also the only day for household maintenance. Clothes had to be washed, the room cleaned as best it could be, any repairs made. For deeply religious families, Sunday meant church, sometimes multiple services, taking up much of the day. Church attendance was interesting.
Many factory families rarely went to church, too exhausted or too poor to afford proper clothes. But employers sometimes encouraged or even required church attendance, believing it promoted moral behavior and social control. Some churches ran Sunday schools specifically for factory children, offering basic literacy education along with religious instruction.
These Sunday schools were often the only education factory children received. In the 1830s, before compulsory education laws, most factory children were illiterate. They couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't do arithmetic beyond the basics needed for their work. This trapped them in their class position. Without education, they had no chance of better employment. They'd work in mills or similar industries their entire lives, then their children would do the same. The Sunday schools tried to address this, teaching children to read, using the Bible as text. They'd learn letters, simple words, then progress to reading verses. Some children learned remarkably well, hungry for knowledge despite their exhaustion. Others struggled, their minds too tired from the week's work to absorb new information. Teachers were volunteers, often middle-class women motivated by religious duty. Sometimes patient and kind, sometimes frustrated by children who fell asleep during lessons. Let's talk about play and recreation, because children need these even in the harshest circumstances. Factory children had little time for play, but they found moments. During meal breaks at the factory, children would play simple games, marbles, if they had any, hopscotch, drawn in dirt, tag. These games required no equipment and could be played in brief bursts. On Sunday afternoons or Saturday evenings, children might venture outside their immediate neighborhood, exploring slightly further. Cities had few parks or playgrounds in this era, but there might be a canal or river to walk along, fields on the city's edge to run in. These expeditions were adventures, rare chances to see something beyond brick walls and machinery. Street entertainment was also popular. Traveling performers would set up in public squares, jugglers, musicians, puppet shows. These shows were usually free, relying on donations, so poor children could watch. For a few minutes, they could forget their exhaustion and just be children, laughing at a silly puppet or marveling at a juggler's skill. Some children formed gangs, not criminal organizations, but social groups for protection and companionship. A gang might control a particular courtyard or street, defending it from other groups, organizing games, sharing resources. Older children looked after younger ones. These gangs could provide a sense of identity and belonging that the factory never offered. Crime was common, inevitable, really, given the poverty. Children stole food when hungry, coal when cold, anything they could sell when desperate. Pickpocketing was a specialty of street children, those even worse off than factory workers. Some factory children dabbled in petty theft, usually out of necessity rather than preference. Getting caught meant harsh punishment. Whipping for first offense, prison or transportation to Australia for repeat offenders. Alcohol was another escape. Gin was cheap and potent, offering temporary relief from misery. Many adults drank heavily, spending wages on alcohol that should have gone to food. Children drank too, sometimes. Pubs didn't card customers. The 10-year-old with the penny could buy gin. This was seen as a moral failing, evidence of working-class depravity, rather than a symptom of conditions that made people desperate for any escape. Let's think about education more broadly. By the 1840s, there was growing recognition that an educated workforce was economically valuable. Factory work was becoming more complex, requiring workers who could read instructions, do calculations, operate more sophisticated machinery. Self-interest was beginning to align with humanitarian concern.
Various educational initiatives emerged. Ragged schools, started by philanthropists, provided free education to the poorest children. Mechanics institutes offered evening classes where workers could learn trades, mathematics, basic science. Some mill owners started schools for their workers' children, though the quality varied wildly. The 1833 Factory Act's requirement for children to receive 2 hours of education daily was poorly enforced, but did push some mills to provide basic schooling. These mill schools were often miserable places. One room, one teacher handling 40 or 50 children of different ages, minimal resources. The teacher might be barely literate themselves, hired because they were cheap. Students sat on benches, wrote on slates, learned by rote memorization. But even bad education was transformative for some children. Learning to read opened worlds. A child who could read might graduate to better-paying work as a clerk or shopkeeper. They might read newspapers, understand politics, envision different futures. Literacy rates among the working class began climbing slowly through the mid-1800s. The role of family deserves attention. Factory families were under enormous stress. Fathers worked long hours, often in different factories than their children. Mothers worked too, sometimes in factories, sometimes taking in piecework at home, sewing or laundry. There was little time for traditional parenting, playing with children, teaching them, providing emotional support. Yet bonds of affection existed. Parents loved their children even when circumstances forced them to send those children into dangerous work. Siblings looked out for each other. Families celebrated small joys, a special meal on a birthday, a rare day trip to the countryside, an evening of songs around the fire. These moments of warmth sustained people through the hardships. Death was a constant presence. Infant mortality was staggering. Half of all children born in industrial slums died before age 5. Those who survived childhood still faced shortened lifespans. A factory worker might live to age 40 if lucky, often less. This meant children frequently experienced loss. Siblings, parents, neighbors. Funerals were regular occurrences. Most families couldn't afford proper burials, so the dead went to paupers' graves, unmarked and shared with strangers. The psychological toll of all this is hard to calculate. Modern children are protected, nurtured, given time to develop. Factory children had none of that. They grew up fast, became hard, developed defense mechanisms against constant stress and trauma. Some became bitter. Some resigned. Some surprisingly resilient. Human adaptability is remarkable, but adaptation to horror doesn't mean the horror is acceptable. As we step back from these details, a picture emerges of life as a totalizing system of exploitation. Factory work wasn't just a job. It was an entire existence that shaped every aspect of life. Where you lived, what you ate, when you slept, whether you received education, your health, your prospects, your very lifespan. All of this was determined by your position in the industrial economy.
There were occasionally paths out. A particularly clever child might catch the attention of a philanthropist and receive sponsorship for better education. An apprenticeship in a skilled trade might open doors. Marriage could change circumstances, though for girls, marrying often just meant trading factory work for the different drudgery of running a household on poverty wages. A few individuals rose through exceptional talent, luck, or ruthlessness. But these were exceptions. For most factory children, their class position was permanent and hereditary. Communities did form, though. In these grim courtyards and cramped streets, people supported each other as best they could. A neighbor might mind children while parents worked. Families would share food in emergencies. When someone died, the community would contribute pennies for the funeral. This mutual aid was essential for survival in an economy that provided no safety net. Women's lives deserve particular attention. Girls in factories faced all the dangers boys did, plus additional ones. Sexual harassment and assault were common, with overseers and male workers taking advantage of young girls who had no recourse. A girl who complained might be fired, and her family couldn't afford that. Pregnancy outside marriage was catastrophic, usually meaning loss of work, exile from family, and a future of prostitution or destitution. Women who worked in factories after marriage faced impossible burdens. They had to work full shifts, then come home to all the domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, laundry. There was no such thing as maternity leave. Women worked until they went into labor, sometimes literally working until contractions made it impossible. They'd give birth, rest a few days if fortunate, then return to the mill because missing wages meant the family starved. Infant care was heartbreaking. Mothers who had to work couldn't breastfeed their babies. They'd leave infants with neighbors or older siblings, often drugged with opiates to keep them quiet. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was given to babies freely, keeping them sedated while parents worked. Many infants died from overdoses or from the neglect that resulted from their caretakers being children themselves. The gender wage gap was enormous and deliberate. Women doing the same work as men might earn half the pay. The justification was that women didn't support families, though many did, or that women were naturally less productive, though evidence showed otherwise. Really, women were paid less because they could be, because laws and customs gave them fewer options and less power to demand fair treatment. Let's think about aging in this system. A factory child who survived to adulthood and kept working in mills would be worn out by their 30s. Bodies that had been overworked from childhood gave out early. Backs hunched from years of bending over machines, lungs damaged from breathing cotton dust developed into full consumption, hearing loss from constant noise, vision problems from working in poor light. By 40, a factory worker was often unable to continue heavy labor. What happened then? There was no retirement, no pension, no social security. If you couldn't work, you relied on family, if they could afford to support you. Many ended up in the workhouse, those grim institutions for the destitute. Workhouses were deliberately made unpleasant to discourage use. Families were separated, men from women, parents from children. Inmates performed hard labor for minimal food. Many preferred to die in the streets rather than enter the workhouse.
The workhouse was the ultimate failure of the industrial system to care for the people it used up. You could work your entire life, from age 6 to age 40, in service to the factories, and still end your days in institutional poverty. This was the reward for a lifetime of labor, indignity and abandonment. The system extracted everything from workers, then discarded them when they were no longer useful. Yet even in these circumstances, people found meaning and joy where they could. Friendships formed in the mills that lasted lifetimes. Romances blossomed despite the circumstances. People fell in love, married, built families, tried to create good lives within impossible constraints. They celebrated holidays, sang songs, told stories, maintained traditions. Human spirit persists, even in the darkest conditions. Religious faith helped many people endure. The promise of heaven after earthly suffering provided comfort. Methodism, with its emphasis on personal salvation and moral improvement, became hugely popular among the working class. Chapel services were social occasions where workers could feel dignity and community. Some preachers also advocated for social reform, connecting Christian duty to improving conditions for the poor. The Chartist movement, the early trade unions, the cooperative societies, all of these represented workers organizing to demand change. Though progress was slow, each small victory built toward larger transformations. By the 1850s and 1860s, conditions were gradually improving. Not dramatically, not quickly enough, but measurably. Working hours were shorter than they had been. Some children were receiving education. Wages were slowly rising. Housing remained terrible, but some cities were beginning to address sanitation. Public health movements advocated for clean water and proper sewage. Mortality rates began to drop. These improvements came from multiple sources: factory reform laws, economic growth that allowed higher wages, technological changes that made some dangerous work unnecessary, and the political pressure from organized workers. No single factor was responsible. Change emerged from the interaction of economic, political, and social forces, pushed forward by activists who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. But let's not romanticize the progress. In the 1860s, children were still working in factories. Families still lived in slums. Poverty was still crushing. The improvements were real but modest. A shorter workday meant 12 hours instead of 14. Better housing meant 2 rooms instead of 1. These changes mattered to the people experiencing them, but they didn't fundamentally transform the exploitative nature of industrial capitalism. The divide between rich and poor remained vast. Factory owners and investors accumulated enormous wealth, while their workers struggled for survival. The mills that employed child labor made fortunes for their owners. Those fortunes funded grand houses, art collections, political influence. The Victorians celebrated their prosperity, the British Empire at its height, without acknowledging the foundation of suffering that wealth was built upon. This is the world beyond the factory walls. Cramped housing, inadequate food, minimal education, disease, early death, but also community, resilience, love, and a slowly growing consciousness that things didn't have to be this way. The children who worked in the mills came from this world and returned to it each night, trapped in a cycle that was extraordinarily difficult to break. Their lives were more than their work, but their work dominated and shaped everything else, leaving little room for the simple joys of childhood. As we move toward the conclusion of this long night's journey, let's trace the slow transformation from the darkest days of child labor to something resembling the protections we take for granted today. The story isn't one of sudden enlightenment or dramatic revolution. It's a story of grinding, incremental progress over decades, pushed forward by activists, reformers, workers, and eventually by economic and social forces that made continued exploitation less tenable. By the 1860s, the Factory Acts had established a framework for regulation. Children under 8 were prohibited from factory work in textiles. Older children had limits on their hours. Schools were slowly spreading, even if quality was poor. Factory inspectors, though too few, at least existed. These protections applied mainly to textile mills, but they established principles that would gradually extend to other industries. The Education Act of 1870 was a watershed moment. It didn't make education compulsory yet, but it created board schools funded by local taxes, providing free or very cheap education for working-class children. For the first time, there was a systematic effort to educate all children, not just the wealthy. Attendance was voluntary, and many children still worked instead of attending school, but the infrastructure was being built. The 1880 Education Act finally made school attendance compulsory for children ages 5 to 10. This directly conflicted with factory work. You couldn't work 12-hour days and attend school. The law created a choice, and increasingly families chose school, not out of idealism necessarily, but because they calculated that educated children would have better prospects and could support the family better long-term. By 1891, free elementary education was established nationwide. No more fees, no more economic barrier to schooling. Combined with compulsory attendance laws, this meant that by the 1890s, most children were spending at least part of their childhood in school rather than factories. Child labor didn't disappear. Children still worked in agriculture, in street trades, in home industries, but the most brutal factory exploitation was finally declining. What drove these changes? Multiple factors converged. Economic development was crucial. As Britain's economy matured, the type of work changed. Heavy industry needed skilled workers, not just unskilled child labor. Machines became more sophisticated, requiring training to operate. Employers began to see that an educated workforce was more valuable than cheap child labor.
Demographic changes mattered too. Birth rates began declining in the late 19th century as families realized they didn't need as many children for economic survival. Infant mortality was dropping due to better sanitation and nutrition. Families could invest more in each child's education and development rather than relying on quantity for security. Political enfranchisement played a role. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 expanded voting rights to working-class men. Politicians now had to consider workers' interests, not just those of property owners. Labor unions grew in strength, particularly after full legalization in 1871. Organized workers could strike, negotiate, and pressure politicians in ways that had been impossible earlier. Social and cultural attitudes were shifting too. The Victorian era saw the emergence of a new concept of childhood as a distinct phase of life deserving protection and nurturing. Middle-class families were keeping their children in school longer, delaying their entry into work. These new ideals of childhood gradually extended downward to working-class families, creating pressure to treat all children better. Scientific understanding advanced. Doctors documented how child labor damaged health and development. Public health advocates showed connections between poverty, child labor, and disease. This evidence-based approach to reform was more effective than purely moral arguments. When you could show statistically that child labor harmed national health and economic productivity, even skeptics had to listen. International factors influenced Britain too. Other industrializing nations were addressing child labor, and Britain worried about competitive disadvantage, but also about its international reputation. Being seen as a nation that brutalized children wasn't consistent with Britain's self-image as a civilized leader of the world. Reform became tied to national pride. Let's be clear, though, this progress came far too late for the generations who had already suffered. By the time meaningful protections were in place, millions of children had already worked in conditions we would now consider criminal. Many had died. Others had been permanently damaged physically and psychologically. The reforms prevented future suffering but couldn't undo past harms. There were also persistent gaps in protection. Agriculture remained largely unregulated. Domestic service, where many girls worked, had few protections. Street trades, home industries, small workshops, all of these employed children under conditions that remained harsh. Even in regulated factories, enforcement was inconsistent. Laws existed but were violated regularly, especially by smaller employers who flew under inspectors' radar. Child labor in other parts of the British Empire continued long after it had been reduced in Britain itself. Cotton mills in India employed children in conditions similar to early British mills. Mines in Africa and Asia used child labor. Tea and rubber plantations worked children alongside adults. The empire's wealth continued to be built partly on child exploitation, just moved to places where British reformers couldn't see it. The early 20th century brought further improvements. The 1903 Employment of Children Act set minimum ages and maximum hours for children in various trades. The 1918 Education Act raised the school leaving age to 14. By the 1920s, child labor in its Victorian form had largely ended in Britain. Children were in school, not in factories. Childhood was finally becoming a time for education and development, rather than exploitation. But we should acknowledge what was lost in the process. The transition from agricultural to industrial society, accelerated by enclosure and factory development, destroyed older ways of life. Communities that had existed for centuries were disrupted. Skills and traditions were lost. Extended families were separated as people migrated to cities. The Industrial Revolution brought prosperity and progress, but it also brought profound dislocation and suffering. Some historians argue the Industrial Revolution was necessary, that the economic growth it enabled eventually made everyone better off, including workers. The standard of living did rise dramatically over the 19th and 20th centuries. Material conditions improved. Lifespans increased. Education spread. Modern medicine developed. All of this was built on industrial wealth. But this defense requires us to accept that the suffering of child workers was an acceptable price for that progress. It asks us to balance the shortened lives, the injuries, the stolen childhoods against GDP growth and technological advancement. That's a moral calculation each person must make for themselves. But it's worth remembering that the children who suffered had no choice in the matter. They paid a price for a future they wouldn't live to see. What lessons can we draw from this history? First, that economic systems aren't natural or inevitable. The factory system that employed child labor was created by human decisions and sustained by human choices. It could have been different. Owners could have chosen to pay higher wages and employ fewer children. Society could have regulated earlier and more aggressively. The suffering wasn't necessary. It was chosen, implicitly, by people who prioritized profit over human welfare. Second, the change requires sustained effort from multiple directions. The factory reform movement included religious activists, political leaders, workers' organizations, journalists, investigators, and sympathetic business owners. No single group could have succeeded alone. Change came from building coalitions, maintaining pressure over decades, and refusing to accept that the status quo was unchangeable. Third, that economic arguments against reform are often exaggerated. Mill owners predicted catastrophe if they had to reduce hours or improve conditions. These predictions proved false. British industry remained competitive and profitable despite reforms. Sometimes economic interests genuinely conflict with human welfare, but often the conflict is overstated by those who benefit from exploitation. Fourth, that legal reforms, while necessary, aren't sufficient. Laws must be enforced, loopholes closed, regulations extended to cover all work situations. The early factory acts were largely symbolic because they lacked enforcement. Real change required inspectors, penalties, and sustained oversight. Writing a law is the beginning, not the end of reform. And fifth, that cultural and moral arguments matter. The reformers who documented factory conditions, who wrote passionate denunciations of child labor, who appealed to conscience and decency, they changed how people thought about the issue. Laws followed cultural shifts. When enough people became convinced that child labor was wrong, change became possible.
Finally, that progress is neither automatic nor permanent. The protections child workers eventually won came through struggle and can be lost through neglect. Even today, child labor exists in many parts of the world, producing goods for global markets. The fight continues, just in different places and forms. As we come to the end of this long story, it's worth pausing to remember the individual children who lived through these times. Not statistics or historical forces, but actual children with names and personalities, dreams and fears. The girl who wanted to learn to read but fell asleep over her letters because she worked 14-hour days. The boy who lost his hand in a machine and became a beggar because he couldn't work anymore. The siblings who looked after each other in the mills, forming bonds that helped them survive. These children were betrayed by the adults who should have protected them. Parents who had no choice but to send them to work. Employers who valued profit over safety. Politicians who delayed reform. A society that looked away from suffering when acknowledging it would require uncomfortable change. The betrayal was collective, systemic, woven into the fabric of early industrial capitalism. But the children's stories also include resilience and resistance. They helped each other. They found moments of joy. They survived. Some of them grew up to join reform movements, determined that the next generation would be spared what they endured. They testified before parliamentary committees, their words helping to change laws. They joined unions and fought for better conditions. They taught their children to read and write, opening doors they'd never been able to pass through. The legacy of child labor in the Industrial Revolution lives on in multiple ways. The wealth it generated funded much of Britain's infrastructure, institutions, and global influence. The reforms it eventually prompted established principles of labor protection and child welfare that spread worldwide. The suffering it caused remains a cautionary tale about the human cost of unregulated capitalism. When you wear cotton clothing, remember it might have been children's hands that first made such cloth cheap and widely available. When you benefit from public education, remember it was partly established to prevent the exploitation of factory children. When you see child labor in modern supply chains, remember that it once existed in the heart of what we consider the civilized world, and it took generations of struggle to reduce it. The children of the Industrial Revolution didn't have advocates who could tell their stories adequately while they lived. Most died unknown, unmourned except by their immediate families, buried in unmarked graves. But their experiences shaped the modern world in profound ways. They paid the price for progress they would never enjoy. The least we can do is remember them, honor their suffering by learning from it, and work to ensure no children today face what they faced. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of Mary at her spinning mule, running back and forth, tying broken threads with raw fingers. Think of the thousands of children like her, in mills across Britain, across the developing world, across the centuries. Think of their lost childhoods, their stunted lives, their unrealized potential. And if you can, let their memory inspire you to support policies and practices that protect children, that value human welfare over profit, that recognize the fundamental dignity of every person regardless of their economic utility.
The Industrial Revolution was a turning point in human history, bringing technological advancement and economic growth that transformed the world. But it was also a moral catastrophe in how it treated its most vulnerable workers. Both truths can exist simultaneously. Progress and exploitation went hand in hand. Understanding this paradox helps us navigate our own time when similar tensions between economic development and human welfare continue to challenge us. As the night deepens and you feel sleep approaching, let the rhythm of this long story carry you into rest. Let the details fade while the broader themes settle into your consciousness. Let the struggles of the past inform your understanding of the present. And let the knowledge that change is possible, that sustained effort can transform even deeply entrenched injustice, give you hope for the future. Sleep well, knowing that the children of the Industrial Revolution finally got the protections they deserved, even though it came too late for many. Sleep well knowing that people fought for them, that reforms happened, that childhood eventually was recognized as something sacred to be protected. Sleep well, but remember, always remember. The machines have stopped now. The factories are silent. The child workers have gone home to rest. The long day is finally over. Dawn will come, as it always does, and with it the possibility of a better world. Until then, sleep peacefully and dream of justice. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into one of history's darkest chapters. The story of child labor during the Industrial Revolution is not an easy one to tell or to hear, but it's an important one. These children deserve to be remembered, their suffering acknowledged, and the lessons of their experience carried forward. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please like, subscribe, and share. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Should we explore Victorian medical practices, the daily life of medieval peasants, the truth about pirates in the Golden Age? Your suggestions help shape what comes next. Remember, history isn't just dates and events, it's people, real people with hopes and fears, people who lived and loved and suffered and survived. By understanding their stories, we understand ourselves better and hopefully make wiser choices about our own world. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and I'll see you in the next video.